Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good following morning. It is January 7th. This is AMA number 42. Just after the new year, our first AMA. Not too much going on in the news. I guess we just jump right into some local things. No, of course. Huge stuff going on. I'll talk about it in a little bit. My guest is going to come on in a few minutes. Good friend, Zack Bodner, who is the CEO of the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, a real thought leader and amazing just leader in our JCC world and in North American jewelry. So I'm excited to talk to Zack, who's a hell of a smart guy and a good guy, and we'll see what's going on in the world of Zack. Good morning, Sebastian. Good morning, Jeffrey from San Francisco. Whatever Benji's about to say about politics, you already agree. Yeah, let's get to that in a minute. First, I almost feel like once we go on the path of talking politics, it's going to be very, very hard to get off that path. So we will discuss it, and I'll discuss it, I'm sure, with Zack. I have a feeling whatever I have planned, it might be a little bit about that. So I had a birthday this week, 51. Not as traumatic as 50 with New Year's Eve and my birthday. Very, very rare for me to be in Poland because of my obsession with warm weather and the sun. Usually always I'm away around this Christmas, New Year's, my birthday period. But of course, because of the virus, stayed here in Krakow, had a nice New Year's, very quiet. My Kasha's family is visiting, well, her mom and her nieces and the two dogs are staying with us. So it's a sort of very full house we've got going on by us. And so it was nice. New Year's, we did a little New Year's, just us for the 5 of us. We had just a little New Year's Eve ball where we all dressed up. I made myself a octopus costume. We dressed up as animals. I taped 8 balloons to myself, and 6 balloons because I have 2 arms, and made myself an octopus. So it was a lot of fun. And then my birthday was also very quiet, relaxing, had some cake and some pizza, of course, pizza. And I got a present. I got some books, some nice presents as well. Ola, who works with me, made me some amazing, her version of William Greenberg black and white cookies, which were even blessed by Carol Becker, who is the queen of William Greenberg, the owner of William Greenberg herself. So that was kind of cool. And Kasha got me something very cool, but I haven't received it yet because she ordered it, which is a pizza oven, one of those special, their Oni pizza oven, the Oni Karu. So it's like a little pizza oven. It gets really, really hot. So you can make, like good Neapolitan pizza. It goes up to like, I don't know, probably 800 degrees Fahrenheit. You put wood in it. So we're waiting for that, but that's my present, which I think is a very cool present. Got a nice mug, my big mug, which you might remember matches my little, how well you see those kind of little mugs. But anyway, 51 was absolutely much easier for me than 50. I also, because I was playing with balloons with the little kids, my niece is, she is almost 6, and then my other niece is 1. So I was playing with balloons and I started to make balloon animals. And I have to tell you, I really enjoyed it. I made a bunch of different balloon animals. So I've decided to take this up as my new hobby. I will get some balloons, get some good balloons, because these were sort of flimsy, and learn how to make some balloon animals. As I made a pig. Sorry, Avi, I know the pig, Rabbi Avi watching the non-kosher pig. I made a dog, made a dachshund dog, different types of the same balloon animal, but no, all different balloon animals. Shalom from Caesarea. Hi, Rabbi Avi. Hi, Randy Brenowitz. Hi, Randy from Palo Alto. Benji says I don't look a day over 38. Good for you. Benji will make a balloon Jeffrey Rollat. I'd like to see a balloon animal version of Jeffrey Rollat. I would like to see that. So that's what's been going on. In Poland, we've started the vaccine. Luckily, only 160,000 people so far, which is not great considering we have a population of about 40 million. We're still under sort of lockdown. Only food shops are open and drugstores. Almost other shops are closed. People are supposed to stay inside. If you leave the country, it's you have to get in a quarantine when you come back. So that's sort of where we are. Of course, you can't start vaccinating people for corona without having your own corona controversy. That, of course, some politicians and sort of VIP famous people managed to get themselves vaccinated, and there was a big to-do about that. But I'm sure that's the case I'm going to say that's the case in every single country. Good morning, Lori. So that's where we are in terms of Poland. Not too much going on. JCC, everything is quiet here. The little kids with the preschool, which was the only part of the building that was open, is on winter break. So they'll come back next week. So it's even more quiet than usual here at the J. And that just leads us to what's going on in the United States. Wow, I don't know, unprecedented, all the time there's an idea that if you're making any kind of argument or if you're making any sort of point and you have to refer to Hitler, that's like you've lost the argument already. In other words, oh, but Hitler does this, or Hitler would have done it, or worse than Hitler, or something Hitler. Anytime you bring Hitler and the Nazis in, there's an idea that you've lost the argument. Well, I understand the logic of that, but I think that watching Trump for the last 4 years or 5 years since he really became a candidate, and having observed him for 35 years or so, 40 years, as long as I can remember, I think the comparisons were not too far off. I think the difference would be that Hitler cared about something. What he stood for was terrible and evil and racist and taking over the world and all that. And I think Trump only, and I think this has been true from day one, and anybody who knows him at all or has observed him would with any sense would have to see, Trump only cares about Trump. If certain things happen to benefit others, if you happen to be the benefit of a tax break, then that's good for you, maybe so. If you feel that it's important for the American embassy to be in Jerusalem, not in Tel Aviv, and I was happy to see that as well, then Trump is good for you. But make no mistake, and I mean, not saying it after the fact, I've been saying this all along, and not only myself, I'm not the only one who's been saying this clearly, is that Trump only cares about himself. The only thing that's in his mind is whether this is good or bad for Trump. So all of this idea of making America great and patriotism, I think that it's very hard to find a citizen in the United States that hates the United States or doesn't care about the United States more than Donald Trump does. How much do you have to despise the country you're in to enable it or help it almost burn, encourage people to burn down the country because to protect your ego? Rabbi Avi says, I can't say honestly Trump is worse than Hitler. Yesh gvul. Yesh gvul means there's a border, which is also the name of an organization in Israel. I did not say that Trump is worse than Hitler. I said that I didn't say that. You can go, Avi, and I'm sure as you'll do, religiously rewatch the AMA as you have done for the previous 41. I did not say Trump is worse than Hitler. I'd say that the comparisons are not as far-fetched as people would say. People have different circumstances. I think Hitler had beliefs that he believed in and used and based, guided by those beliefs, killed 6 million Jews and caused the death of millions of others, tens of millions of others. And I think Trump does not believe in anything except his own malignant narcissism and believes in himself. So I didn't say Trump is worse than Hitler, and I would appreciate if you would not say that I said that. I'm comparing the two because I think that you have people who the assault on democracy by the two is something worth comparing. And I think the idea that Germany, I will also say that I'm not a historian, but living in Poland for 20 years, being a Jew and a community leader living in Poland in a community down the road from Auschwitz for 20 years, gives you a certain insight on the Holocaust and dealing with Holocaust survivors and people who come here to learn about the Holocaust. So I will say that I am not an expert on the Holocaust or the Nazis, but I'll say I probably have thought about this a little more than the average person who doesn't live where I live and go through what I'm going through every day in terms of who I deal with. And I will say this, that Germans in the 1930s felt emasculated. Germany felt emasculated after World War I. And Hitler was a very charismatic person who was able to press certain buttons. And he was able to do what he was able to do because people went along with him. And in my opinion, the problem in the United States is not Trump. Trump is what he is. Trump is a monster. He's the devil. He's a horrible guy, whatever you want to say, a clown, a buffoon in many ways. Trump is what he is. And I don't blame Trump, and I don't even really blame the people yesterday who stormed the Capitol. There are always lunatics, disenfranchised wackos in any society. The problem with Trump is that there are supposed to be checks and balances on a system. There are supposed to be decent people who stand up and don't allow that person to come to power and to rule. If you get on the subway, you're a business owner and you take the subway to work, on your way to work on the subway, you pass dozens of people that are insane and have issues and problematic people. You don't offer those people the keys to your company. In other words, there are supposed to be systems in place that don't allow us to let this type of people rule and put them in power. And people and the Republican Party, it will take a generation for this stain to be removed from the Republican Party. Trump is what he is. He doesn't even try to hide what he is. Trump is, in many ways, as much as a compulsive liar can be honest, Trump doesn't try to hide what he is. Trump is very straightforward about what he is all the time. The people that have enabled him are really the ones here who are the most at fault. And considering after what happened yesterday, after this whole riot and tirade and attack on the Capitol and all that we saw yesterday, all that the world saw, disgustingly saw, the idea that 6 senators and something like 71 Republican congressmen still after what they'd seen, still went on record and supported this disproven by 61 out of 62 courts, when there were 61 out of 62 lawsuits that lost, the Supreme Court of the United States, the states themselves. The fact that they still went along with this charade is nothing less than sedition and treason. And I think that that's the real shame of it, is that people put self-interest. And to me, and I'm going to make one more Hitler comparison, Avi, because over the last 4 years, I think I've read a lot more about Hitler than I had in the 16 previous year living in Poland. In the beginning, there were people who were they didn't like Hitler, and I'm not talking about Jews or the common people. I mean, people in the government, and they were like, listen, he's a fringe person. We can use him for our purposes, and we'll always be able to control him. It's not going to be such a problem. And this is exactly what the Republicans did with Donald Trump. We'll get our tax breaks. He's good at tapping into this populist streak of the population. That'll be good for us. We'll get our Supreme Court justices. They didn't think they'd get 3. They got 3. Unfairly, in my opinion, but whatever. Tax breaks for corporations and for the wealthiest. They got what they got, and they made a deal with the devil, and now the chickens have come home to roost. So there you go. Trump is never going to do what Hitler did. I don't think Trump, it's hard to compare a person from one generation to another. I'm just saying that I think that Trump is somebody completely lacking of morals, completely devoid of any human decency or any type of moral character. There are no brakes on him. And I think given the choice between protecting his ego or pressing a button and blowing up the world or whatever it would need to do, he would sacrifice anything to protect his own ego. He's that insecure, and that's a very dangerous person. And again, Trump is what he is. Nobody in New York City that's read the New York Post for the last 50 years, although they did shamefully endorse him this year. You've been able to follow him in the New York Post since 1980 or so, seeing that this guy is a buffoon, but he became a dangerous buffoon, and any people who enabled him have to answer, whether they answer in this part of this world, or if they believe in the next world. People should have to answer for what he's done. Absolutely shameful period of American history. And all of those who've said, oh, but he's not so bad, oh, but he's good for the Jews, you're wrong. He's not good for the Jews, because anything that's bad for the planet and bad for the country and bad for the world is bad for the Jews. And since when does being a Jew thinking about only what it means good for the Jews? This to me is not a very something that I see as a Jewish value whatsoever. That's my rant. Thank you very much for listening. And now I will introduce really an amazing guy, somebody I look up to, who I'm honored to call a friend. Zack Bodner is the CEO of the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto for the last 7 years. Before that, he was the Pacific Northwest Regional Director of Aipac, where he did a lot of good work. He has a master's in philosophy of religion and theology. He has an undergrad degree from Yale. He is on the board of the JCC of North America, the American Friends of Tel Aviv University Northern California chapter, the Toby Family Philanthropy. He's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful leader and a very, very cool guy. And he is joining us in a moment. So, good morning to you, and I hope that your picture will. There he is.
Hey, good morning,
gentlemen. 7 a.m. Looking good. Doesn't look like 7 a.m., but it is. How are you?
No, you can see. It's still dark here on my in my sliding glass door. You can see outside. It's still dark here in California. But I'm up early for you, Jonathan. I could never say no to you. You asked me to come speak to your ginormous fan base, and I just couldn't resist the opportunity.
My massive fan base, Zach. We'll see.
Absolutely.
Growing. We believe in the pyramid type of growth. We don't want it to start moving up until we really have that solid base.
Yes, of course. That's the way it should be, right? The Bear Burachov model might not be quite apt at this point, but I figured, I might as well join you this morning. We got nothing else going on in the world, right? It's pretty quiet period of 48 hours.
Right. So I was going back and forth and just saying, do we just jump right into it, or do we at least try? But I have a very important opening question for you, Zach.
Okay.
First of all, how are you?
I think the new term of art is COVID fine, right? Like before yesterday, it's like, how are you? COVID fine, which kind of covers despite this, and this, I'm okay. My family's healthy. Thank God. My kids have decent Wi-Fi to be able to do school from home. These basic necessities are nice to have when you have so many people around you that don't have that. So that's what I would have said before yesterday. Now, since yesterday's news, I don't know if you want to get into that or not, but I got this pit in my stomach now. It's just an anxiety that sits there, so we could talk through that if you're interested.
I did. I wanted to ask because actually something I didn't know about you. I knew about your time at Aipac and of course your tenure at the JCC as the CEO in Palo Alto at the Oshman Family JCC, but I did not know that you were a legislative assistant in the California State Senate. So I did want to ask you, just as an opening question, if you ever during your time there had to defend the Senate against an armed insurrection.
No, that did not happen while I was there. I was actually in the California state legislature. I worked for a state senator but who did have a national and an international scope. His name was Tom Hayden. Some folks may remember him from, the Chicago 7.
Jane Fonda.
Right, exactly. Married to Jane Fonda, which is one of his claims to fame. But he was also his story was resurrected in a recent movie that was on Netflix done by Aaron Sorkin about the trial of the Chicago 7. So I worked for him back in 1998, and it was back when he had decided that he needed to try to fight the establishment from within the establishment, and it was a wonderful learning opportunity for me. He was somebody who was a great mentor and from whom I learned a lot. We didn't always agree politically, but that was something that I also learned as a maturation process for myself, that I needed to be able to work with people with whom I disagreed, work for people with whom I might not have seen eye to eye, but we always found a way to respect each other, to have mutual engagement. And that's what this community, this society, that's what democracy is all about, Jonathan, as you know, that you need to be able to coexist with people with whom you have different opinions, but there are some things that are outside the pale. There are absolutely some beliefs and some actions, of course, that deserve no place in a democratic society. But again, I keep pulling you back into this potential morass, so I'll let you drive the conversation.
I did want to show you though that
nice shirt.
Your honor, Zach. I should show everybody. I'm wearing a wonderful shirt. That was a present from Zach, from his JCC.
I have a few of yours, but I didn't wear them this morning. I thought I'd wear a collared shirt, but I got the ride for the living shirts. I have JCC Krakow shirts. I have a number of gifts that you've given me over the years too, Jonathan. Thank you.
You know, I tried because I think one of the challenges during COVID is if you're in a managerial position, or just, I think for any of us to sort of keep ourselves sane, you know, there are a lot of the ways that we had to do that are gone. And, you know, our worlds have become in many ways smaller. So for myself, I don't know if when I'm getting dressed in the morning, if I see, I don't know, if I'm going, I don't know, I have a talk about the bicycle ride. So with somebody about Ride for the Living, I'll wear socks with bicycles on them. Or I'm talking to somebody who's, you know, in Hawaii, I'll wear palm tree socks, and nobody else knows about it. It's just a sort of game myself. So I try to somewhat thematic.
Yeah, they call that the tie of Silicon Valley. Like Silicon Valley folks, as you know, because you've been here a number of occasions, they don't wear ties even when they're getting dressed up, but they wear fancy socks like the ones that you wear. It was Justin Trudeau kind of made it much more of a mainstream thing. But in Silicon Valley, we've been doing it for years, and that's the way we wore our ties, but they were through our socks.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's funny that you mentioned. I actually remember that Justin Trudeau, that there was a big thing in the news, and they kind of focused in. He was at like the G8 or something, G7, whatever, and they focused on it, and there was a whole big thing about his hipstery socks.
Yeah.
So before, I want to talk to you about Aipac a little bit, and I mean, I'm sure everything will lead to Trump. So because you were at Aipac for a long time.
I was.
And how did you get to Aipac? What was that decision like to get? How did you end up there?
It's a great call, a great question. I mean, so you know, my path has been a windy one to Aipac and now to the JCC. I went to school on the East Coast. I went to college at Yale, and then I did my junior year abroad at Hebrew University. So it was at that moment when I was at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, my junior year, when it clicked for me, and I realized this is what I want to do with my life. I want to do something for the Jewish people. I want to do something for Israel. I didn't know what it would look like. I really didn't. And so my first job out of college after I graduated was taking kids on the teen tours, American Jewish kids to Israel during the summer. Great experience. I parlayed that into a job at the JCC in Los Angeles. There were 5 JCCs in LA at the time, all worked together. And I worked with all the teens in LA. And it was a great 2 years, but then I felt like I needed to do a little bit more. I went to graduate school, got a graduate degree in philosophy of religion and theology. And then I felt like I needed to get out of academia, and I didn't know where I was going, but I thought politics might be a good route. So I got into politics, Jonathan, and that was when I got the job in Sacramento with Senator Tom Hayden. And I felt like this was a great experience. It was opening my eyes. He gave me a tremendous amount of responsibility. I was helping craft legislation, literally write the laws. And I remember saying to him at one point, who am I? I'm a 25-year-old pisher. Why do you trust me to write these laws? And he pointed to his wall of books back behind him and said, you know, the law books. He said, who do you think wrote all those laws? It was 25-year-old associates like you, you know, that. So, but I knew that I wanted to do something related to Israel and the Jewish people. So I was gaining my political chops. And from there, from my work at the state legislature, that's when I parlayed my work into the job at Aipac. And so in February of 2000, I started as the deputy director in the Pacific Northwest in San Francisco. And the Aipac setup is, its home base is in DC, of course, with 10 offices around the country to mobilize the grassroots. And I was the number 2 in the office in San Francisco, and it covered Central California all the way up to Alaska. And I started in February of 2000. And if you recall, February of 2000, this was when peace was going to break out, right? This is when we were drafting the talking points for what would be the largest peace package, the largest aid deal in history, because the Israelis and Palestinians were going to have a peace deal. And of course, Barak and Arafat went to Ehud Barak. I have to clarify these days. Ehud Barak, right? And Arafat and Clinton went to Camp David, and then it fell apart. And then by September of that year, the second Intifada erupted, and my job had become very different. We were working 7 days a week. We were basically doing rapid response. We were doing community engagement. We were helping people kind of respond both politically, but then also on the front lines. And that experience opened my eyes, and that's how I got to Aipac.
It was the last, I would say that was the last optimistic time. I won't say peace between Israel and the Arab countries, but between Israel and the Palestinians. That was 20 years. And that was actually the time that I think about a lot as well, because that's right when I was finishing the army. And I sort of had this army experience that was the late 90s, 2000 was probably the most optimistic few years you could have spent in the army, that you really felt that, you know, that peace was at hand.
Exactly. And that was also the last time, Jonathan, that Israel had a prime minister that came from the left, right? Since that moment, so it's been 20 years that Israel has had political leadership that leans right. And that's what's led the liberal American Jewish establishment to feel like, that Israel is moving in one direction, to feel like the American political establishment that is pro-Israel, like Aipac, has moved to the right, even though it's not true. It's, the pro-Israel establishment, Aipac, is a bipartisan organization that works with both sides of the aisle. But when you have the leadership in Israel for 20 years representing Likud, or the Likud offshoots that, Omar came from and Tzipi Livni came from, right? But it's all basically, then, you have a democratic representative in Israel chosen by the people saying, look, we tried to make peace happen. It didn't. So now we need to take care of ourselves. We need to take care of our security. And the last 20 years has I think, really kind of opened up a fissure in American Jewish politics, partly because of lack of understanding of what's happened in Israeli politics. And you get that, and we could go deep on that, and I'd love to if you're interested. But that's part of what's led to what we're doing now.
What your Z3 and the way that you've been able to sort of open up this discussion or broaden this discussion in North American Jewry is absolutely something that I want to get into with you. But in terms of Aipac, you talk about Aipac being nonpartisan, which is challenging. It's not an easy thing for an organization to do, because at certain points, and I'm specifically talking about these last 4 years, and with Donald Trump and with the invitation to Donald Trump, which I have to say that I personally was against. And I think that anytime, and you probably have some insight into the inner, although you weren't working there at the time, but you're still obviously very connected after being there for such a long time, and also being so involved in the American-Israeli dialogue at this point. There's a question. Do you say that the nonpartisan aspect trumps everything? Pardon the choice of words. Or do you say that there are, sometimes there are lines and someone's behavior can sort of be beyond the pale, which is my sort of way of thinking, but not necessarily Aipac's way of thinking?
Well, it's actually yes and yes, right? It's elu va'elu in our tradition. It's both do exist, and Aipac embraces both. And now I want to just say that, of course, I'm representing myself. I'm representing the Oshman Family JCC. I'm not representing Aipac, but I will share with you the answers to your questions, and I will talk a little bit about Aipac's philosophy, because I was there for 14 years. I was there for 14 years, and so I was kind of inside. And I know that Aipac has always had the same philosophy, Jonathan, which is the rule of friendly incumbency. You stick with your friends. You stick with the one who brought you there. It's the old Frank Sinatra line: you dance with the one that brung you, right? Like you don't leave somebody in the middle. So if you have a congressperson or a senator who has been good to you, and even if your Jewish brother who was fought in the IDF and is a Zionist and is going to run against them, you don't leave that person who's been the friendly incumbent, because what message does that send to all those folks in the Congress who are not Jewish but are supportive of Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship, if it looks like the pro-Israel community is just going to jump ship as soon as somebody who's Jewish runs against them, right? So Aipac is operated by the rule of friendly incumbency, but they don't endorse candidates, right? So they encourage the pro-Israel community to endorse candidates. They encourage members on their own accord to Democrats, Republicans. But the underlying philosophy, Jonathan, is that we as Jews, we know what it's like to not have power. We know what it's like if we don't have access to those in political power, and we will never, ever allow ourselves to be in that position ever again. In American politics, we will never allow ourselves to be in a position where we don't have access to political power. And that means, because it flip-flops between Republican and Democrat, Aipac's philosophy is we need to make sure we have access to whomever is in office, and you can't do that if you endorse one party or another, or one candidate or another, okay? And so it may feel like you have to sometimes embrace people who you don't like their other politics, right? I remember being at Aipac when we had at the policy conference some very conservative Christian Zionists speaking. And some of my constituents from San Francisco who were pro-LGBTQ were like, how can you have this individual speaking? And we say, look, we're not taking them on any other issue. It's not about prayer in school. It's not about abortion. It's not about LGBTQ rights. It's about Israel. And they thought that was very too narrowly focused, right? And I said, look, we have to build our alliances with folks around a single issue. Now today, I would say we're doing the same thing with those folks on the left, right? We're saying if folks are pro-Israel, even if they have, association with movements on the left that some folks would not appreciate, right? And there's been this issue of intersectionality for the last 3 to 5 years, right? About, where is BLM on BDS, for example. You have to embrace these folks on the left and the right and the center for their pro-Israel cause, but it's become a lot trickier today, Jonathan. So to just kind of fast forward, AIPAC invites the incumbent president of the United States to speak at the policy conference every year. And if that happens to be Obama, that happens to be Obama. If that happens to be Trump, it happens to be Trump. But they won't invite those candidates running against the incumbent in that second year of office, right? In the fourth year, it's different. But they don't invite those. So there was a lot of people that didn't understand why did AIPAC only invite the Republican President Trump and didn't invite the Democratic candidates who are running. But it's the rule of friendly incumbency that dictates that. Both sides of the aisle. It went both ways. It went, and now you have a situation where you have a president who has done something awful, to use the term that you said in your introduction, right? And probably illegal, probably it's definitely unprecedented. And so the AIPAC put out a tweet last night, and they rarely do this. So I don't know if you saw this, Jonathan, but here I'll share with you what they tweeted. They wrote, quote, "We share the anger of our fellow Americans over the attack at the Capitol and condemn the assault on our democratic values and process, period. This violence and President Trump's incitement of it is outrageous and must end." So that's the Elu V'Elu. And still we can, embrace a process and a political establishment that is working towards a bipartisan support of Israel. And yet if somebody goes off the reservation, if actions are outside the pale, if there's an embracing of hatred and an attempt to bring down our capital, that's something that deserves criticism on the strongest level.
Well, thank you for reading that tweet. I'm I don't say surprised, maybe slightly pleasantly surprised to hear that, just because, I think that's a strong stand to take for an organization that's threading, I think, a very fine line. It's also something, it's always interesting to me also as, as an Israeli citizen and an American citizen of, and again, I don't want to make this so much about AIPAC, and I think we're going to circle back around to Israel because I want to talk about Z3 and a lot of the good stuff that's going on there, because I think that's really one of your sort of lasting, will be, one of your, well, we'll see what else you'll do, but lasting contributions and legacies is really the whole Z3 and the idea, not only the conference itself, but the idea behind it. But, I think, well, personally, I'm around so many Jews who will forgive just about anything. And then they'll say, oh, but it's good for Israel, good for this is good for Israel, that good for Israel privately. But then when anybody says dual loyalty, and I'm like, if I were on public television, if I was on TV right now, I wouldn't be saying this, but this is sort of a little bit internal. So sometimes there is this idea of, wait a minute, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If Israel is the most important thing and you're voting, and then you are sort of opening yourself up to questions if you're sort of putting the United States. Not saying that AIPAC is doing that at all, but I'm just saying it's always sometimes Jews can go a little bit too far. And listen, it's our homeland. We didn't have it for thousands of years. We have it, and this is one of the issues that that you're dealing with, that the conference is dealing with as well. But I just sort of something, and I think that AIPAC has become, it was never such a contentious organization. 5-10 years ago, nobody was really going, up in arms and having these giant discussions about AIPAC. But
well, it's interesting because I think that the dual loyalty claim is one that's very dangerous, and that is kind of masks the anti-Semitism, right? And AIPAC has always said it is, and I believe it is, and I believe it always will be an American organization. An American organization. They are always lobbying for what's in the best interests of America, and happen to believe that American and Israeli interests are aligned 99% of the time. But there are those moments, and I was there when Israel was trying to sell military equipment to China in 2001. Israel was trying to sell military equipment to China, and Israel, an American legislator said that can't happen. Remember, right before 9/11, we were on the verge of war with China. People don't remember anymore, but China had shot down one of our jets, and Bush at the time was about to go to war with China, and then of course 9/11 flipped everything on its head. But we were the marriage counselor, AIPAC, between America and Israel, saying, look, this has to be dealt with because it's not okay to sell arms to a potential enemy or adversary of America. So AIPAC was not going to lobby in favor of this aid package and this arms package being sold from Israel to China, right? But we also were going to come out and publicly say, condemn Israel. That was something that we felt like there's enough public, as you know, condemnation and criticism of Israel. AIPAC didn't want to add to that cacophony. So they worked behind the scenes to get, the President of the United States of America and the Prime Minister of Israel to work together to figure out a solution. But so as an American organization, AIPAC has always said America is the first priority. And there's also the belief that most of the time the agendas overlap. Not all the time, but most of the time.
Yeah.
But it gets tricky, it gets nuanced. And to your point, it's gotten very political and partisan over the last 5 years. And I think that that's a shame because there are issues that do transcend politics. There are issues that we should all be able to agree on. And America's national security interest, it should be one of those issues, right? They used to say that issue, foreign policy gets checked at our borders. And as soon as a Republican or Democrat travels overseas, we are a united front in American politics. That's changed. That has, and it's a shame. It's really a chaval and a shame. And I'd like to see us moving back to the age where we could agree on a number of issues while also disagreeing forcefully and vehemently, but respectfully.
I think that it's a time of, maybe the 60s, which is a little before both of our times, with that a time where the basic ground rules are changing. And it's always, this period of flux in terms of that, what's in terms of politics, in terms of what's acceptable. And, the danger is if you keep pushing, you kind of keep pushing things, you lose sight of where you were in the first place. And yesterday was, hopefully, you say, oh, is this just an aberration? Are we moving toward this idea of, separate facts? Are we just people living in two separate universes? I see people today on social media who are like, what are you talking about? There's nothing wrong happened yesterday, where it's hard, you keep, I think people who are seeing it from my point of view, certain from your point of view are like, wait, what has to happen? Wait, this one, how many Dayenu moments do we have to have? Calling an hour-long conversation that you have recorded to the Secretary of State of Georgia, asking him to find a specific amount of votes. For me, that's black and white, but not for people. The attack yesterday, not for people. So I think the challenge is, not specifically for AIPAC, but for any people dealing in terms of politics these days, are just how these things we're at such a moment of flux that it's hard to see that we're going to come out of this with the same ideas or the same.
But that's the job that you and I have, Jonathan. And I would say that as folks who are running Jewish community centers, Yehuda Kurtzer, our friend from the Shalom Hartman Institute, once explained to me that there's a spectrum on which, like, advocacy organizations are over here and community organizations are over here. Advocacy organizations, you can have people that all believe the same exact thing. Community organizations, you have to have a mix of different types of beliefs, right? Again, there are some beliefs and actions that are outside the pale, but those of us who are running community centers, Jewish community centers, I believe we need to create a safe space where people can disagree passionately, respectfully. And we have to recognize, I represent the Jewish Community Center in Palo Alto, which is in Santa Clara County, okay, Silicon Valley. Now, in the last election, 25% of Santa Clara County voted for Trump, Jonathan. So while you and I personally may have our own opinions, I have to make my space in my JCC a place where everybody feels welcome. And if I have to believe that 1 out of every 4 people that's coming to my JCC may be a Trump supporter, maybe a Republican, that means that I say certain things differently out loud. That means that I create a public expression that's a little bit different, and I want that. But again, there are some actions and words, because words lead to actions that are just not acceptable. But within the acceptable framework, the tent, I say that all the time, that you can have a really, really broad tent, but it still has to have tent poles. Otherwise, the tent drops to the ground and it's a tarp laying on the ground. It does nothing. But we try to have a really, really broad tent, Jonathan. And that's why we're able to, when it comes to Zionist thought, when it comes to Israeli politics or American politics, we want to have a place where people can come together and disagree. And yet, where do you draw the lines? Where do you put up the polls these days? I put out a statement last night, Jonathan, to my community. I'm not sure if you saw it.
I read it. I saw it.
Yeah. And it was basically just saying, look, we are still a safe space. We're a place where all of you in the community can come and feel comfortable. And I already received a little bit of hate mail. I've already received, most people were very appreciative and thanked me, but there was already those people that said, you're outside of your lane. You shouldn't be talking about politics. There were people who said, where were you when the BLM protests were happening? Where was your condemnation then? Right. So we're never going to make everybody happy. But I saw a funny meme the other day that said, if you want to make everyone happy, don't be a leader, go sell ice cream.
Still, probably selling ice cream, you still get critics. I think you mentioned the 25%. 25% voted for Trump. I think I know that. I think I know all of those people that are part of it. I happen to know all of them.
Yeah, and we have to make our place okay for them to feel like they can come as well. I believe that. I do believe that.
But one of the interesting questions really here, though, is what about the lines? When we say that, there's a caveat attached to everything that you're saying, a safe space and the tent and room for everybody under the tent, but not exactly. In other words, within certain parameters that the community establishes as the boundaries. And I think what's been challenging for many of us in these last 4 years is that the leader of the country, his behavior is clearly outside of the established parameters of what we see as acceptable.
Right.
In other words, getting up there and saying there are good people on the Nazi side and on our side after Charlottesville, that is not within the safe space that we're talking about, in my opinion.
I think that you're right. So, free speech is something that in democratic countries like America and like Poland, free speech is highly valued as kind of it's aspirational. Okay, it's
Fair
aspirational,
enough.
But free speech is the greatest value that we can hold on to. And yet, not all speech is considered free speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. It's not allowed, right? So we say, all right, that means we could put limits on free speech, not on free speech per se, but on who comes to speak at our JCC.
And America is bigger on free speech. There's an idea that the American idea of free speech is universal, but it's not. In other words, laws, you can walk around in a Nazi uniform in the United States, and you can't do it in many places in Europe, Poland included.
That's right. That's right. And yet you still, the KKK is not able to become a political party and run for office in America. So there are still some limits, even if you can walk around in a Nazi uniform and you can put up a Nazi flag hanging from your house. But that doesn't mean we who run a JCC have to invite that person into our JCC, right? That's where we have a little bit more flexibility than the government of the United States. So where do we put up the tent poles? Where do we draw our lines, Jonathan? With hate speech. I'm very clearly not welcoming anybody on the left or right who embraces hate speech. And I don't actually believe it's a left or right. I think that that's an artificial creation. I think it's a spectrum. I think those on the far left and the far right actually meet in the level of fascism, because the far left and the far right, they don't want to have anybody who has an opinion different than theirs in the same sphere, which is essentially fascism. Right. But those, so for example, I'll give you an example, a hard example.
So, Zach, and I'm not advocating for the far left or the far right here at all. But I would say, though, I think that, and it might be irrelevant because on a practical level, I don't think it makes much of a difference. But I would say, though, on the far right, talking about people who are really concerned with themselves, this idea of individual liberty, as opposed to the extreme left, which is essentially trying to completely tear down the order on behalf of public. So I think on a moral basis, from my point of view, although I'm not advocating for the far left or the far right, I think that there is, to some degree, a fundamental difference between the two.
Well, I think those are tactics that you might feel like are different. I think at the end of the day, the overlying belief system, which is an unwillingness to accept the other or someone who believes differently, is right. So in my mind, someone who supports BDS, for example, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, is an anti-Zionist movement. And anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, if you ask me, right? So there's no need for me to invite someone who believes in that to speak at the JCC. And by the way, I don't believe that everybody who latches on to the BDS movement is anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic. I want to make a distinction, right? That there's the capital BDS and the lowercase BDS. The capital BDS folks are the folks who understand that the mission of the BDS movement is to end Israel as a Jewish state. Okay. And then there are those people who've latched on to BDS because they don't understand that. And they're like, well, I care about Israel, but I don't like settlements, or I don't like the occupation, or I don't, right? And they're looking for a place to be politically critical. And they think that the BDS movement is the place to be. But unfortunately, the BDS movement is about undermining Israel's existence as a Jewish state, which is anti-Semitic, right? So I won't invite a representative of the BDS movement. And the same way, I won't bring a Kahanist to speak at the JCC. I won't bring somebody from the right wing who embraces the Proud Boys or any of the, why should I? I don't believe that free speech extends to hate speech. I just don't. And I don't feel like we need to do that on one side or the other. And when we're trying to build a tent for Z3, for Zionist conversations, we have to be very, very explicit with that, because people want to understand why this one was invited to speak, but not this one. And it's tricky.
It's very delicate to tread that space. Now, because I'm a terrible interviewer and I just am happy to talk with you as my friend, we just blah, blah, blah. But I do want to get to a couple other things, because I want to bring it back to Z3, because to me, that's really a fascinating thing that you've built. But tell me a little bit, because you are the CEO of a very interesting institution. Can you talk a little bit about your JCC and your community for just a couple minutes? Because I think people hear like, oh, JCC, Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, like it's a fascinating part of the world for many people, and it is an interesting place in terms of that's kind of become really the center in some ways. The kind of intellectual creativity, and in many ways is really seen from a business standpoint, from a technological point of view, is coming from there and coming from many of the people that are involved in your community.
Yeah. Well, I've been running the JCC as the CEO for just over 7 years now. This JCC has existed since the late 60s, but we are on a brand new campus in a new building right now that was built in 2010. So we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary on the campus, 2009. And it's thank you. It's a beautiful campus. It's large, 8.5 acres. It's state of the art. And what we did that was, I think, revolutionary was we partnered with a senior living group so that seniors and the JCC community are interwoven, right? The old model was if they shared a campus, well, let's just take the old folks and put them over here and have everyone else over here. But the JCC in Palo Alto did not do that. We kind of integrated the living. So on the first floor is a lot of the JCC typical stuff. We have a fitness center, we have a preschool, we have a camp, we have after school care program, we have a theater, we have Jewish and Israeli education and holiday celebrations. And on the second, third, and fourth floors, right above every building, are the seniors. So they can look down, they're all members, they come, they walk on our outdoor, and it's an indoor-outdoor campus, right? Because of the California climate, we can have a place where 90% of the time people can walk indoors and outdoors. So first of all, the thing that makes it unique, Jonathan, is the setup, the architecture, and the way it was designed so that it's multi-generational and truly interactive. And before COVID, we would send our preschoolers up to do Shabbat with the seniors, and it was great. It was like I kept wanting to see this kibbutz come to reality, and it was almost like that, right?
It very much, as living on a kibbutz, having lived on a kibbutz for 7 years, I will tell you that your JCC is very kibbutz-like.
Well, thank you. So that's the first thing that I think is unique, is that we want to create a warm, welcoming space. And now we know that warm, welcoming spaces are not only in person, but virtual as well. And you've done that. You've created a virtual space here on Facebook Live. You recognize that as you're right bumped up against a synagogue, you share a space. So spaces are important, virtual spaces, live spaces. We want to create a warm, welcoming space. The second thing is, we know that people do Jewish differently today. They do Jewish differently in Silicon Valley for sure, right? The way that your and my grandparents did Jewish is not going to be the same way that our kids and grandkids will do Jewish. We know that. So we wanted to make our JCC an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity, a place where people could try out their unique expression of doing Jewish. And it was important for us to make the space warm and welcoming for people of all different stripes, all different colors, all different backgrounds. People who are born Jewish, people who have converted Jews, and people who haven't, but who have married somebody who's Jewish, perhaps, or people who have, we have a member of our board of directors who's not Jewish. She's married to somebody who's Jewish, but she's the one who cares about making sure that the kids do the Jewish stuff, right? So I'm not going to say you're not Jewish just because you didn't have a Jewish mother. Like for me, I'm embracing her and I'm making her part of the Jewish family, right? So that's the second thing that makes us unique, I think, in Palo Alto, Jonathan, is that we try to embrace all different types of Judaism and make ourselves an incubator for these new expressions of Jewish identity. And people come out to the West Coast and Silicon Valley in particular, it's like the Wild West. They try to do things differently, right? If New York Judaism was kind of the defining way that Americans did Jewish for the last 100 years, what is West Coast Judaism going to define? I think that there's a lot of really cool things happening on the West Coast. A lot of your friends and my friends who created Wilderness Torah and Urban Adamah and Moishe House and At the Well. And there's just a lot of really cool, innovative things happening on West Coast Judaism. So we want Silicon Valley and the JCC here in Palo Alto to be an amplifier and a platform for folks like that who are doing really cool things Jewishly. And Zionism is no different. We have 35,000 Israeli expats, Jonathan. as an Israeli expat yourself, you're always welcome there. You'll fit right in, as you've seen. And we have a program called the ICC, the Israeli Cultural Connections Department, that has been doing programming for Israelis for 15 years. And it's revolutionized the way Israelis get involved with American Jewish organizations.
Which is remarkable. I just want to say, because, I don't know if everybody watching this knows, but you and I, as professionals in this world, understand something which is that Israelis generally, for the most part, and it's changing, and you're working to do that, and you're really one of the few examples so far that's done a good job with that, I think, and I'm sure that there are other new ones that I'm not aware of, but Israelis can very often be very isolated. Talk about a Jewish community, and even in Europe, we'll talk about, oh, how many Jews are in Bucharest, and they'll say, oh, 8,000. Oh, how many Israelis? Oh, 25,000, as if the Israelis aren't Jewish, and of course the vast majority of them are. But it's almost like the tradition, the expectation is that Israelis have not been connected, or don't see themselves. Their identity outside of Israel is much less Jewish and much more Israeli. And you have been, I think, the leader in terms of actually, and it's not the right word to use here, but in some sense, integrating the Israeli, bringing the Israelis in out of the cold and making them part of your community. So you through the ICC, you've done this, but what's the magic? What was the secret of just coming up with a free body inside your institution? Is it because you guys are all so clever out there in Silicon Valley? How did you do it?
No, it's a great question. And people ask what's the special sauce all the time, because I think that this is the one thing that's been really unique about our JCC. We have a great preschool, and we have a great fitness center, and we have a great cultural arts, but a lot of JCCs do. The thing that sets us apart in many ways is the fact that, like you said, we've been able to bring the Israeli community in and do Israel-related programming for years. So people are like, what's the special sauce? How do I bring it to my JCC? And it's a fair question. And the truth is, Jonathan, like anything, it's about your people, and it's about the relationships they have in the community. So my predecessor brought in an incredible woman named Ronit Jacobs, and partnered with Orly Rinat and some of the other Israelis in the community to build it, right? And if you can identify the right people in a community who have connections to everyone and who are respected by everyone, it makes all the difference in the world. So it's really Ronit and Orly and their teams have built this incredible infrastructure. And then that's the first thing. So it's the people and the relationships. The second thing is the way they go about doing it is opposite of what most American Jewish organizations do. And most American Jewish organizations, we have our program directors and the top leadership to say, okay, what's needed? How do we come up with a clever title and a creative name for something? And how do we then build something, and then let's push it out, let's market it. And if a lot of people don't come, we're always beating ourselves up saying, how come we didn't market this better? What did we do wrong to get the word out? But the Israelis did it differently. They started from the bottom up, and they went out to the community and they said, what do you need? What do you want? And when they said, okay, we want a program for young Israeli moms, fine. They said, okay, we need a program that's going to teach Hebrew to our kids who are being born and raised in America, but we know that they have Israeli parents. Okay, we need a program that's going to help these new Israeli immigrants that have come here and they don't know how to get connected and how to get. So, we have now programs for all of these, but the people said, this is what we wanted. And then Ronit and Orly and the team said, okay, then you help us build it. So they built it from the ground up, the bottom up, Jonathan, which is very different than most American Jewish models, which is very top down. So those are the two kind of secret ingredients that I would suggest, is getting the right people, and then building the model from the bottom up, going out on a grassroots listening tour and asking people, what do you need? What do you want? And then it's over the years, it's morphed. It used to be just providing Israeli programs for Israelis. They wanted a home away from home. They wanted a place where they could hear a great lecture from an Israeli in Hebrew, or listen to an Israeli rock group in Hebrew, or get together with their friends and connect in Hebrew. Now, like you said, we're integrating or bridging. We haven't come up with the right language yet after all these years. Language is still a challenge, right? But we want to bridge Israeli Jews and non-Israeli Jews so that they recognize, like you said, that it's not, who are the Bucharest Jews and then who are the Bucharest Israelis. We're all part of the same mishpacha. We're part of the same family. So how do we bring, and how do we bring American Judaism to Israelis who think that you can only be secular or dati, right? But there's a lot in between that we've done in America. And then how do we bring Israeli Judaism to America? Because American Jews can gain a lot. So for example, we do a Yom Kippur service for Israelis, because Israelis are not going to services for the most part. 500-600 Israelis come, but it's not a typical, Yom Kippur service. We're reading the poetry of Yehuda Amichai, for example, right? It's a very different thing, and people love that. And I think American Jews can gain a lot from Israeli Jewish spirituality. And we have to introduce that as a way of bridging and integrating. So it's been one of the fun challenges that we've been encountering.
And one of the ways that you've sort of gone beyond your community and tried to have this impact is through Z3 with your idea. Now, Z3 is not only a cool name, it sounds cool, and it's not, of course, named after you, but not only named after you.
Not really.
People like JCC, I'm like, what do you mean? Jonathan's Community Center. So
yeah, exactly.
So, but Z3, with this idea that we're in a new phase, a third phase of Zionism. So can you maybe talk about just sort of, you know, and this has become this conference that's really become something massive, and you brought it online this year, and I was lucky enough to participate in person a couple of years ago, and now online, and it's something that is really, I think, you know, it was one of those things, the best ideas are ideas that you're like, wait a minute, we didn't even understand. I mean, we sort of understand that was a problem, but the solution sort of makes it so obvious that was something that needed to be dealt with, and you've really taken the lead out there, and through your experience with all that you've done with the ICC and bringing the Israelis in has sort of gotten you, and you know, your wife is Israeli, so you know, I guess, you know, you Aipac, studied in Israel, so this is always something. Your children are Israeli as well, so this is something that's obviously very close to you personally and professionally. But maybe just talk a little bit about this idea of what are the first stages of the first two stages of Zionism, Z3, what you've done so far, and what the goal is.
Excellent. Thanks, Jonathan. And I love that you've been a partner in this project for the last several years. Thank you for coming. Thank you for partnering this year when we did a big virtual event. But Z3 started Zionism 3.0. You know, in our minds, we are in the third phase of Zionism, the third phase of the Zionist ideology. Zionism 1.0 was pre-1948. That was the Zionism of Herzl, of if you build it, they will come, right? That's the modern day. If you will it, it is no dream, essentially. But it was the Zionism of dreaming, of hoping, of saying we have to escape the persecution. Zionism 2.0 was 1948 to around 2000 or so. And that was the Zionism of building the state, right? You went from the pioneers to the builders. It was the Ben-Gurions, and it was the Golda Meirs. And it was the idea that, okay, we have this state now, and we need an influx of Jews. We need Jews to make Aliyah. And those of us who are going to stay in the diaspora, well, you have to support Israel unequivocally, right? You have to support Israel financially, diplomatically, politically, but you have a stake, but no say. You don't live in Israel, so you don't get to have a say. You get to have a stake, but you have to support us. And what happened in 2000, as we talked about with the kind of breaking open, the launching of the Second Intifada, and I will say launching because I do believe it was launched by Arafat and his cronies. It wasn't a popular uprising like the first Intifada. So with the launching of the Second Intifada, you started to see rifts breaking within the American Jewish establishment, the American Jewish community. There'd always been criticism of Israel, but that was on the fringes, right? And that kind of seeped inwards, where more mainstream Jews were saying, well, I'm not sure what's going on with Israel, whether it's their treatment of the Palestinians or their who is a Jew question, right? So what happened around 2000 is the birth of the Zionism 3.0 moment, when American Jews said, maybe we do get to have a say. Maybe we should be able to partner with Israelis and figure out how do we think about the Jewish homeland, which is our homeland too, and have a stake and a say. And then there's a lot of different opinions about that, by the way. I, for one, believe that we should have a say, maybe religiously, in what's going on in Israel, but not security-wise. Like, again, I don't live there, not politically, I don't vote there, but religiously, if it's the Jewish state, it should be the Jewish state for all Jews everywhere. And what does that mean? And how do we have a consultative process that allows us to have input? So that's the era we're living in, Zionism 3.0, this third moment of the torchbearers, as Einat Wilf says, the torchbearers moment, right? So back in 2014, you might remember that the Iran deal was blowing up, right? And President Obama was now supporting the deal, and it was causing another rift within the Jewish community. And so we had an event at the JCC where we had 2 people in favor of the deal and 2 people against the deal come to speak. And up until then, most people were having people talk about why the deal was good or why the deal was bad. They would only have a speaker on one or the other. And we brought together 2 people for and 2 people against, with the local NPR, National Public Radio announcer moderated. 800 people showed up, Jonathan. It was like we didn't have enough space to cover them all. And we realized we could have a conversation with both camps, and it could be respectful, it could be productive. And we said, okay, we need to do this when it comes to the Israeli-American break. We need to do this when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian issues, secular and Orthodox issues. So our first Z3 Zionism 3.0 conference was really to bring in the far left and the far right, the Orthodox and secular, folks that no one else could bring together. And it was also hugely successful, sold out, over 800 people. And then over the last 7 years, it's evolved so that the Z3 conference is now about a mindset shift, right? It's about recognizing that how do we bring Israelis and Americans together? How do we bring Jews together? How do we transcend our differences and recognize that we are one people? So Jonathan, you and I, because we run JCCs, we are able to engage with those who are Orthodox and those who are secular, those who are left and those who are right, those who are Israeli and those who are from the diaspora. But that's becoming a lost art, unfortunately. So we're trying to build this movement where people could say, okay, let's transcend our differences. I get it. I get that you're a pro-settler movement. I get that you're, a Tel Avivnik secularite who lives on the beach and doesn't want anything to do with the settler movement. And yet, how do we come together and argue respectfully and love each other the way that you might with your crazy Uncle Larry at a Passover Seder? Because there are differences of opinion in our families, right? And we're seeing that more and more with the Trump-Biden splits or the Trump-Obama split, right? So we have to find a way to transcend our differences, to recognize there's a diversity of voices, and to recognize that we're equal partners, Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews. So those are the three principles.
What are the parameters? So in other words, I assume that because you have to have rules in anything. So I'm guessing that here it's a belief in the necessity of the existence of the state of Israel, right? You're not having somebody come in who feels that the country doesn't deserve to exist, right? So the buy-in, if you will, is that you believe, and then once you establish that, once you believe in the existence of the state of Israel, then how and what you think is best for it and stuff, that's what you want to discuss.
Right, and it's the caveat is believe in Israel existing as a Jewish and democratic state, right? That's where we kind of, because
Jewish and democratic.
Yes, and that's what allows us to push out those on the far extremes, right? Because the greater Israel folks might be like, I'm of course a Zionist, but I want to expel every Palestinian. No, we wouldn't want them there. And those who say, of course I believe Israel should exist, but not as a Jewish state, as a binational state.
Right.
That allows us to push those folks on the far left. So by saying that our bottom line belief, and we don't talk about borders, we don't talk about the other final status issues like Palestinian refugees in Jerusalem and settlements. We just say, if you believe that Israel should exist as a Jewish and democratic state, if you believe that you're a Zionist, you're welcome here. I know we're bumping up on our time frame, Jonathan, but I'm going to let you drive this because you are the driver, you're the interviewer. So I just wanted to keep that in mind.
Isn't there, and I lost you for a second, so I'm sorry if I just cut out here something. We have Krakow Wi-Fi, not Palo Alto Wi-Fi. We didn't invent Wi-Fi. So isn't there a danger though? I agree with you. The idea of Israel as the state in the way that it was intended, or at least that I feel, and I think you feel, that it was intended to be a Jewish democratic state. But isn't there a danger of preaching to the converted? I mean, you're discounting an increasingly large amount of people by saying, oh, without those and without those, whereas that is not those aren't as fringe points of view as they used to be.
You're actually getting to one of the most difficult topics for us as we're dealing with this as Z3 grows and as the Zionism 3.0, which used to be a conference of 1,000 people every year. And this year, when we went online, we had 5,000 people participate, including a lot of folks in your community. And we've already had over 30,000 people stream our content since the week-long conference over Hanukkah. And this is the most important question we're going to have to answer over the next year plus, which is how do we continue to put up tent poles? How do we continue to have red lines over which you can't cross? And yet, how do we become open to those in our community who are questioning and who are challenging? And the example I will give is there are a lot of young people today who are being drawn to, the open Hillels, for example, because Hillel on campus, in many cases, is not allowing a certain type of speaker to speak. And so then there's this open Hillel movement. And now all of a sudden by saying, well, you're not invited, you're not able to participate because you're associating yourself with a pro-BDS movement. Well, as soon as you say you're not invited, then all of a sudden you've given a lot of credit and a lot of oxygen to that group. And the example is Peter Beinart. Peter Beinart has been a speaker at Z3 over the years, but when he just came out with his new article saying he no longer believes in a two-state solution, he's a one-stater. Yeah. Does that mean he's no longer invited to speak? Now, officially, according to our rules, it puts him outside the tent. He would not be invited as this, but as soon as now you say, we're not inviting you, Peter Beinart, then you're giving him oxygen. And all these people make him the rallying cry. So trying to balance how you still have firm polls and yet knowing that as soon as you say you're out, that's going to give them a lot more oxygen is a real important challenge that we have to grapple with, Jonathan.
So what's the Peter Beinart, what was the answer?
So we are working on it right now. We didn't have to deal with it this past year at the conference because we weren't dealing specifically with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We had Ron Dermer, the Israeli ambassador. So he's touched on those issues, and he was being interviewed by Ethan Bronner, a left-leaning reporter. So it was a very vibrant conversation. But we didn't have a panel on that issue like we have had in years past. So we didn't have to deal with that issue. And you might say, well, that's skirting the answer to the question. But we're living to fight another day, as they say. You don't have to answer every single question and every single challenge immediately. But we're figuring that out. But as of right now, that's not an invitation that we would be extending.
It's interesting because I would say, Peter Beinart is somebody who feels he would call himself a Zionist, and he believes, it's just that where he's sort of moved in a certain way, and saying because your opinion is moved to a certain degree, although you consider yourself a Zionist, you're not, you're no longer welcome. It's I mean, you have to have lines, but he's a particularly complicated example. And I mean, yeah. I think that the difficult examples are the ones that do the best. If you're testing your system, you want to test it with those examples, not an easy one, or it's not a test.
Right, but he's put himself, it's one thing to say, I don't think a two-state solution is possible. It's one thing to say, I think a one-state solution is more likely down the line, but it's another thing to say what he said, which is, I believe in a one-state solution, right? Yeah. That's basically calling for the destruction of the Jewish state. As you and I know, a generational shift over the next 20 years with a binational state means the end of the Jewish state. And our people cannot afford to ever see the end of the Jewish state. We know what happens when there's not a place to rescue Jews from Yemen, Jews from Ethiopia, Jews from Entebbe. We know what happens when there's no state to take care of the Jewish people. As great as America has been for the Jews, as great as Poland is becoming now because of leaders like you, we still have a long ways to go, but there still needs to be a Jewish state. And you and I would agree, you put your life on the line fighting for the IDF to ensure that Jewish state would exist. So how could you feel good about being at a part of a conference, Jonathan, if you had a speaker who would say, I don't believe that there should be a Jewish state? I don't think you'd feel good.
I agree. I would say, though, that what's making the Jewish state, what's making it less likely for Israel to maintain both its Jewish and democratic nature are not somebody like Peter Beinart, who's writing a column, are more the leaders on the ground who are doing things that are making the solution an impossible solution just because of logistics and things. So I would say, certain politicians or many politicians are in Israel at this point are doing things that are creating a situation that is such a complicated puzzle that there's just no way of creating, of doing that. And in some ways, while they can say whatever they're saying, but by continually allowing certain settlements in certain places. Now, I'm not saying all settlements or anything, but certain things that everybody has always understood would not be part of any sort of two-state solution. But by that definition, you're also creating a situation which is making a Jewish democratic Israel impossible. You're forcing the hand.
And yet, what we're trying to do with Z3 is create a space where we can have a diversity of voices. When you were living in Israel, when you were serving in the military, there were people in your unit who had a variety of different political opinions and religious opinions, I'm sure. And even more so now that they're opening up to more orthodox for the military. And so Israel has found a way to allow these individuals with differing points of view to coexist in a safe space. And we're trying to do the same thing with Z3. We don't want people to just write somebody off because they are of a different political stripe or religious stripe. Like the point is, we need to find a way to come together. Look, the vast center is being drowned out by the echo chambers on the far left and far right. We know that, right? And I heard Micha Goodman speak, and he talked about how we have a crisis in fast food, right? The fast food movement was the answer to all our problems 50 years ago, right? For these poverty-stricken communities that couldn't afford food, the people that fast food was going to solve all that. It was cheap, it was quick. And what happened is we saw a health crisis emerge from the fast food movement. And he says we're now in a fast information crisis moment, right? Yeah. Where people, right, the tweet, the 140 character tweet, the soundbite, people don't take the time to engage with each other. And what we need is a slow food movement type of analogy to a slow information movement. And that's what we're trying to do with Z3. Let's get back into having the conversation, and it takes time, and you have to look past the sound bites and the tweets and really engage with people that you disagree with, but in a way that can be productive.
Amen. I've heard Micah Goodman talk about that. It's a phenomenal presentation.
Yeah, it would be great to get him on the show. I think he would be a wonderful guest for you.
you know, I have to move out of my comfort zone of only interviewing people that I'm like pretty friendly with, not people that I just know. So it's like, oh, I interview all, I'm like, oh, my good friend. And it sounds a little, you know, disingenuous, but it actually is. I'm interviewing people. Zach, I could talk to you all day. And, you know, we've had this talk different ways without people around. So, but I will, a couple closing things that we always get to. One is, are you on Team Latka or Team Hamantash?
Definitely Team Latka.
Yeah, Latka is just kicking Hamantash's ass. And three favorite films of all time.
Oh, you didn't prep me for that. I have to have an answer for this one. This is a tough one. I love Apocalypse Now.
Oh,
that's a great one. Princess Bride, and it's only top of mind because that rereading of Princess Bride.
Oh, what a good book!
Right?
Because he wrote
great book.
It's a good movie. It's a good movie because Goldman wrote the screenplay.
Exactly. And the screenplay follows the book so closely.
Brilliant.
Just brilliant. Absolutely. And I'd have to say, I'm struggling with the third here, and I'm trying to hit a different genre altogether. Maybe Blade Runner, but the original, you know, not the 2049 or whatever it was.
Clearly the original.
Yeah, for sure.
They all make my list.
All right.
Zach, thank you so much for taking the time. Always a pleasure.
Jonathan,
I learn, I'm inspired by you every time I talk to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Send my love to Kasia and the whole community there. I really miss being able to, I've been out there now a couple times, and I was hoping maybe this last summer, of course, nothing happened, but maybe next summer we'll get together again, Jonathan. I'd love to see you.
Absolutely. Love to Ronit. I'll talk to you.
All right, you got it.
Be well.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.